Hello. In this video, we will discuss the second of our three categories of corresponding squares, so-called mined squares. This differs from opposition in that there are specifically only a single pair of squares that correspond to each other. Here, we observe a typical example of this. If white is to move and plays the move king c4 to attack the c5 pawn, black can respond with king b6. Now, all of a sudden, white has no move that continues to defend this pawn. This black pawn on c5 takes away the square b4. So white must retreat and lose the pawn and the game. King c3, king takes b5, and this position is trivially winning for black. How you want to win this position, just out of curiosity, is to simply give away this pawn and hunt down the pawn on g4. The white king won't be able to perform both the roles of defending against this passed pawn and also defending this pawn on g4. So, for example, king b3, king c6, king c4, king d6, king c3, king e5, and black will take this pawn, and white is nowhere near in time. Similarly, if it's black to move in this position and they play king b6, well, then white can play king c4, and this time it's black who must lose the pawn on c5. The pawn on b5 takes away the c6 square, so white will win this pawn and the game. Thus, we can conclude that the squares c4 and b6 are squares of reciprocal Zugzwang. Whomever is to move while both kings occupy them will lose the game. Stepping on one while your opponent can get onto the other leads to you being blown up by the mine. How then should both players continue in this position? Well, there's actually very little you can do, except shuffle and hope that the opponent makes the mistake. This position is trivially drawn like so. White just shuffles between these three squares, and black shuffles between here, and a7 as well. So king b3, king a7 is fine. You always want to make sure that you can meet your opponent stepping onto the mined square by you stepping onto it. Otherwise, the opponent could just capture the pawn. So, for example, if white were to play some kind of stupid move like king b2 here, then king b6, and suddenly we don't have the response king c4, so we simply lose this pawn and, of course, the game, as we saw. In this second example, whomever is to move can force their opponent to step on the mined square and lose their pawn. As we can see, the mined squares here are e6 and c5. You might have also seen this position referred to as an example of a trebuchet. With white to move, the move king f6 will actually win, because white will be able to go around the other way to attack the pawn. This wasn't possible in the previous example because you can't get around this pawn without losing the pawn on b5 first, like this. But here, after the move king f6, black is obliged to give away this pawn. For example, king b5, king f6, and black will have to give away this pawn on d6, because after king c5, king e6, again the white pawn takes away this square, so the black king has no way to keep defending this pawn, and he will lose the game. Because when white takes this pawn, he will be occupying one of the newly created key squares. If it's black to move in this position, then it's actually only a draw in quite a similar way. So king b5, and white needs to be careful king f6 would lose the game to king c4, king e6, king c5, but white can actually draw here by taking the opposition. So king e4, king c4, and now king e3, and if king takes d5, white has king to d3, and this is a draw because the key squares of this pawn are not directly in front of it, there are two in front of it, and with the move king d3, white prevents black from occupying either of them. If in the position with white's to move, black had tried a similar defense, we can see that this would still fail because king e7, king c8, king takes d6, white is occupying one of these key squares, and after king d8, king c6 for example, the pawn will go through as we've seen in a previous video. Now let's see how the concept of mined squares was applied in the game Alekhine against Yates from the Hamburg chess tournament of 1910. At the time this game was played, Alekhine was just 17 years old, and as far as I can tell, this seems to be only his second ever tournament outside of Russia. However, even at this relatively early stage, he demonstrated precise endgame calculation to clinch the victory here against the British player. He realized that the natural move king b4 would lead only to a draw. After this forcing variation, king e6, king takes b5, king takes e5, king takes a4, it looks like white is good here, up 2 pawns, but after king e4, b4, king takes e3, and b5, we suddenly realize that black will be able to queen at the same time, and this position is theoretically drawn. Black would still have to be accurate here. Let's say queen e5. The only move to draw is king d2, but that can be logically worked out because it's the only move that doesn't allow an exchange or the loss of the black queen on f1, and black should be able to hold the draw here. Like for example, queen b2, king e3, queen c3, king e4, and with precise defense, black can hold this. So I can saw all of this, and then maybe he looked at king d4, but this is also not sufficient to win the game because black has the move king e6, and after e4 not taking, but f4, and this causes white to lose the pawn on e5, and this position would be drawn. One observation that he might have made from this is that the squares d4 and e6 are both mined. Thus, Alekhine played king d3 instead, so he didn't step onto the mined square, he played king d3. So he was now ready to meet king e6 by black with king d4. And this position is now quite easily winning. After, let's say, king e7, white has infiltrated, king d5, king f7, e6, king e7. Otherwise, if king f6, then white can promote the pawn with king d6 and e7 next. If king e7 though, then king e5, and white will then go 2 pawns up with a completely winning position. So instead, Yates played the move king d7. So again, he's ready to come into e6 if white tries king d4. So instead, white played e4. So again, taking here would not be sufficient. White will simply then collect up these pawns, whilst black won't be able to. Black's king would be able to perform both the task of stopping the e-pawn and defending his queen side. So he could have played king e6 now, but again, after e takes f5, king takes e5, white could play king c3 and would be in time to pick up both of these pawns and win the game. So the only try was to play the move f4. And, well, again here, the move king d4 would not be winning, because black would have, because now this pawn is passed, so you can't get into c5. Let's say here, in king c5, well, now it's black that's winning with the move f3. So instead he played king e2, and now he's threatening to play the move king f3 and simply take this pawn. So there's very limited options for black now. He has to play the move king e6. He has to prepare to defend this pawn on f4. Now if king f3, it's actually black that's winning, because after king takes e5, black will take the e4 pawn as well. However, this gives us the key insight that the squares f3 and e5 are mined. Thus, Ayakin played the simple but brilliant king f2. And now, black has no moves. If he takes the pawn on e5, then king f3 would follow, and white wins the pawn on f4. So after the move king f2, black simply resigned. Because if king d4, well, white will then take on f4, and this pawn is promoting king c4, e5, king b3, e6. Just keep pushing. King takes b2, e7, b4. You can simply take, and we can see that black is not in time. White will promote, and black is simply too slow here. So after king f2, Yates resigned, and incidentally in this tournament, Ayakin didn't win. He scored 8.5 out of 16, finishing in a tie for 7th. The tournament was won by Karl Schlechter, off the back of his tied World Championship match with Lasker earlier in the year. Thank you for joining me for this coverage of Mind Squares. I hope this helps you to avoid being blown up in any of your games. Please join me next time for the last corresponding squares video, which will be about triangulation. Goodbye for now.